Hi, I'm Diane Hullett, and you're listening to the Best Life, Best Death podcast. And today I've got a really interesting guest from my local area in Colorado. Today I'm talking with Seth Viddal. Hi, Seth.
Hello, Diane.
And Seth is the Chief Operating Officer and the one of three owners of the Natural Funeral Home in Lafayette, Colorado. And they are just offering so much to our local area. And I just am really looking forward to sharing what Seth has to offer. So welcome and tell us a little bit about the Natural Funeral. Just get us oriented. What is it? How did it get started?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So we're based out of Boulder County, and like you mentioned, I have two fabulous partners who founded the Natural Funeral. And my partners are Karen Van Vuren, who has been a longtime advocate in Boulder County for natural death care and who helps people with in-home vigils and wakes and has been a longtime educator. And then my other partner, Dan Ziskin, is an environmental activist and an ecologist who works at INCAR and really has a passion for things that are good for Mother Earth. And Dan and Karen were lamenting that our environmentally forward-thinking Boulder County was missing an ecological or green funeral home. And so back in 2016, they got the idea and created the Natural Funeral. And we opened our doors to the public in 2019, which is when I joined Dan and Karen and began my affiliation with the Natural Funeral. But our goal was to offer these services that were so needed in Boulder County and to really advocate for families' rights and to bring some really environmentally focused options.
I can't wait to hear more about that. And just as like a side note, how did you come to this?
Yes, so really briefly, I have had several other careers, and none of which had to do with funeral service or really end of life care. Most recently, I owned a large construction firm that does industrial and commercial projects. And I had a health event in 2016 that really sort of upended my life and really made me come into focus about my own mortality. My intestine ruptured and it was a near-death experience. I wound up having to go straight to the hospital and was there, had to do an emergency surgery and was hospitalized for several weeks. And when I got out of that hospitalization, my wife and I had, I guess, what could just be called a moment of clarity where we decided that we wanted to focus on end of life care. And so we sold the firm and I went back to school in my 40s. I went here in Naropa to a lovely campus, a lovely university called Naropa, where I got to ask lots of questions. And then in my very last semester there, I actually decided to do an internship at a funeral home. And I got connected with Dan and Karen. And within 2 months of being an intern, we all had a lot of clarity that I was meant to be here and that this is really going to be the focus of the next chapter of my life's work.
Wow, Seth, what a story. What a great story. I love these midlife kind of change stories. When people just go back to school at 40 or 50 to become a certified nursing assistant or a funeral director. That's amazing. So let's talk about this next chapter with the Natural Funeral, because I think you all have really stepped forward into some of the cutting edge stuff in Colorado and in the country. So tell us, what services do you offer?
Yeah, so we like to describe our services as covering both of the fronts that a family really needs to be held by. And one is that we cover the, I'm going to do that thing where you let me rewind. The Natural Funeral covers really two aspects of our service to families. One of them is the practical needs of serving them at a time when there's a decedent and there's a body that needs to be buried or cremated or maybe some other ecological option. But there's also the service and the holding the family through a memorial or a visitation or bringing them back together for time spent with their loved one. And so from the spiritual memorialization, serving a family perspective, we do in-home vigils and wakes where sometimes families want to stay with their loved one for a day or 3 or 7 with their person being in the home. And we help facilitate that with dry ice techniques and with natural preservation of the body. And then, of course, we have lots of involvement with community facilities where we have big events and memorializations for families. So that aspect of funeral service, the coming together, we support. Where we get really innovative as well, Diane, is on the ecological disposition front. And so Colorado had legalized a process called alkaline hydrolysis or water cremation back in 2011. And it was brought to the state as another option for families that has a less of a footprint ecologically than, say, flame cremation or conventional burial. But no one had begun offering that service. And
Right.
so
And
the
that requires equipment and knowledge, and it's a whole thing to begin to do that. So
That's right. It requires a whole new vocabulary, even, right? Because the first question that you get when you talk with a family about alkaline hydrolysis is, what is that? People haven't heard of it. And if you soften the lingo and call it water cremation, there's still some explanation that's required. But we were the first to offer water cremation in Colorado back in August of 2019, and we've since performed over 330 procedures. And then in 2021, body composting or natural reduction was legalized in Colorado. And 15 days after it was legalized, we had already made our preparations for this and knew that it was coming. And so we built out our facility and we laid in the first body to that process almost immediately when it became a legal option in Colorado. So we're bringing these ecological practices within reach to the general public.
fascinating. And do you still also offer cremation if somebody wants that option, or partner with somebody to do that? And tell me about green burial. Do you have an option for that?
We do. We kind of are a just say yes funeral home. We do offer burial. We of course advocate for green burial, and to that end, the Natural Funeral works closely with the Colorado Burial Preserve in Florence, and we work very closely with Lyons Cemetery here in Boulder County, where we've actually purchased a section of the cemetery to do exclusively green burials. So we also, Diane, have done private land burials here in Boulder County. We also do open air pyre cremations here in Boulder County. So really, when a family asks us, can we do this? Then we get to work trying to figure out how we can accommodate that request.
That's fantastic. You must be growing at quite a rate, I'm going to guess. I mean, the demand for your services. So, oh gosh, 3 questions popped in my head. One, I want to hear more about private burial. I don't think I've heard anybody talk about that on my podcast. What is burial on private land like, and is it legal? And tell us how you support that.
Yeah, burial on private land in Colorado is legal. It typically needs to be done on a property that is zoned agricultural or forestry. Although some exceptions to that rule can come into play, but generally the reason that it's easier to work with land that's zoned like that is because the tracts of land are going to be larger, and you can therefore accommodate setbacks from property lines or from where water might run on a property. You
Right.
have to have
This
certain
isn't
distance.
This isn't do it in your neighborhood kind of thing, but I think it is really interesting given the plains and the mountains of Colorado. There are people who have larger tracts of land for whom that might be really an interesting option.
It is, and it is always really meaningful to the families when their place for visitation is right there at their home. And so it's really a special moment. And of course, there's no machinery involved. Typically, we do those are almost always a hand lowered, hand dug graves. And there's so much family and community involvement that people leave with a piece of them really being impacted by what's just occurred.
Huge, just huge. And I love the work of the Colorado Burial Preserve and all that they're doing down there to make this possible to have a visitation place long after private land might be sold in some way. That preserve will continue to be there. And that's so neat that you've created partnerships with these other organizations that are supporting these things. Tell us about the open pyre. What did you call it? Open flame, open pyre. Talk to me. What's going on with that?
Well, so I told you that we really advocate for customers' needs, and we don't pretend to know what the next family is going to want. And so we get requests. A common request, the way this is phrased, is can you help us with one of those Viking funerals? And people have sort of a romantic vision of maybe a raft on a body of water, and maybe there are even flaming arrows that are launched in this raft, right?
Definitely flaming arrows. Yeah, yeah.
It's a lovely romantic vision of a hearty send off, and so we get that from time to time. And while that may be a little bit out of our reach, maybe because we don't have the lake or the raft or the archery equipment, but what we are able to do is offer people an outdoor cremation pyre. And similar to private land burial, we do those on agricultural or forestry zoned property. And we work closely with the fire protection district where we're going to perform the outdoor cremation. And we make sure that there are no burn bans in effect, that the marshals know that we have a fire plan in place. And Diane, it's wonderful. We use cinder blocks to construct a pyre out in the field. We generally bring in over 1,000 gallons of water that we have for fire suppression to keep the practice safe. And then we use a metal grate between the cinder blocks, and we load about 1.5 cords of hardwood beneath the body. And then we place the body on and we cover it with green boughs of spruce or pine or cedar. And then we typically use ghee as our fire starter, if you will, for the process. And then we typically will lead the family through a lighting ceremony where they actually are involved in the ignition of this pyre. They
Wow.
generally start at a sun up and they end at sundown. And there's typically music and dancing and food, and the families just really open up in those days.
Yeah, really, really involved. I was aware, of course, of the outdoor pyre in Crestone, Colorado, but I wasn't aware that it could be done privately in places like Boulder County. Have you done many of those? I'm going to guess it's not common.
It's not particularly common and it's not particularly cost effective. So I should mention that an outdoor pyre it's about $9,900 by the time it's all put together. And so for those reasons and some other practical reasons, it's not selected frequently, but we have done several of them, and we have an expert on staff.
I just think that's so fascinating. I love what you said earlier about you're kind of a yes funeral home. Like you want to support people both in their vision for what happens when someone dies in the home and the transition of the body to perhaps a funeral home, and then what happens in kind of to body disposition. So, I was going to ask you, how is your approach different from what we might call a typical funeral home? I think you've answered that. You're just very much about, yes, how do we make this work for you? How do you feel about pre-planning? Like, do you find most of your clients have pre-planned what they want, or is much of this families responding in the moment after someone has died?
It's a little bit of both. And one thing that you should know is that we've only opened our doors to the brick and mortar facility where we operate out of in Lafayette. We opened our doors in March of 2019. So we're just a little over 3 years old. And that being said, we started with no clients back then, and this year we'll serve over 300 families.
Yeah.
And so we've gone from not existing to serving a family a day in really almost no time. But that being said, people haven't been pre-planning with the natural funeral for decades and decades. So now we have a lot of people, and they're not just from Boulder County. We have people from all over the state who are hearing about these alternative dispositions, or our ability to say yes to their desires. And so they'll drive a long way to come and have their needs met by the natural funeral. And when we get into talking about water cremation and body composting, because those are not available in many other states, we actually have about 25% of our decedents coming from out of state for some of those options.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I feel like there are a few others doing body composting in Colorado, but not many, right? And I think they're all on the Front Range. I don't believe any are in the western part of the state, let alone other states, which don't have that option.
I do not know of any other firms doing body composting in Colorado. I believe that there are 4 firms in Washington state that are doing body composting, but to the best of my knowledge, we're the only firm in Colorado who's offered it.
Got it. I think it's aquamation I'm thinking of, that there are a couple other people doing that, but again, not many.
There's one other operator in Colorado that we are aware of, and it's a group called Be a Tree Cremation out of Denver. And our good friend Emily Nelson runs that operation. It's a wonderful service, and they are focused on water cremation in Denver.
Fascinating. Well, what do you think? I mean, when you look ahead, in some ways you're a fairly new business, but on the other hand, not. Obviously, Karen has been working in this field for years and years, but fairly new to being brick and mortar and serving, as you said, 300 families, a family a day now. When you look ahead 5 years, 10 years, what do you think? What changes might we expect?
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation to speculate. And I do love to dream and vision into the future. And to that end, the Natural Funeral is working on a pretty massive expansion plan right now. We've lovingly begun to call our Lafayette Funeral Home the global headquarters for the Natural Funeral, and where we operate out of a 1903 little Victorian home in Old Town Lafayette. It's become the global headquarters because
I love that.
because we're actively planning for our next funeral homes and our next disposition centers in other states. And so water cremation has been around a little bit longer than body composting. And as such, 25 states now have legalized the operation of water cremation. It's not in all those states yet, but it's legal. And the Natural Funeral would like to have a big role in making it available to people really all over the country.
What do you think?
And
What do you think are the barriers to people choosing water cremation? I mean, have they just not heard of it? Do you think more and more people are choosing it? Sorry if I derailed you from answering the question I asked before. I just get so excited.
perfect. I believe it's an awareness issue. Right now, we don't have competitors in this space. And by that, I don't mean there aren't other people offering it, but everybody who's offering it is almost at capacity for how many families that they can serve. And so I believe that there's a growing need for water cremation as people become aware of it. More and more people are selecting it. More and more people are pre-planning for it. To answer your question about that, I would say the vast majority of the pre-planning appointments and that happen at the natural funeral are people planning for either a water cremation or a body composting. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense to me that those, because they are newer choices, it isn't what the family's going to fall back on, right? If somebody dies and the family has to make a decision, they're probably going to go with what's tried and true, unless the person has said, "Hey, I want to do this. This is my intention, and here's why, and here's the phone number of the natural funeral," right? So you kind of have to know that and make a plan for that. I mean, I think pre-planning is so interesting, right? Because it requires you to face some things that are hard to face. And yet, if you pre-plan, wow, you really lessen the headaches for the people you leave behind. It's just enormous.
It is. It's a wonderful gift to the people that you leave behind because it takes away all of the uncertainty about what a person may or may not have wanted to happen with their body or how they'll be memorialized. And what we find really, Diane, is that people are connecting with options in death that match the values that they lived. And so if a person was a recycler, a composter, they maybe drove a hybrid vehicle, they might have invested in solar panels on their house. That's not the kind of person who wants to have formaldehyde put in their body and then take up a lot of resources in perpetuity. Those people resonate with an option that matches their values. And so if they can have a light footprint in death, or even better yet, if they can have a positive footprint in death, then that's why people are selecting these options. I want to share with you, you asked about trends in the future. A lot of these options are just emerging. And so the math and the science, the research is really starting to analyze the impacts of these options. And what we know is that each conventional burial that uses a casket and a vault and embalming, it we actually have about a 500-pound carbon impact to the planet. And it's really about the same for conventional burial and for flame cremation. But when you jump into water cremation, we have about an 80-pound carbon impact to the earth. And that's from the chemical production that's used in the process. But when we get into the method of natural reduction, we have an 800-pound net carbon sequestration, because we're surrounding the body in wood chips and straw and alfalfa and these natural things and converting the body into soil. We're removing 800 pounds of carbon from the environment. So it has a net positive impact. And then the thing that we're turning the body into further has a positive impact when it goes back to the earth and it grows plants or trees. And so it's really a beautiful story that people are resonating with far and wide.
Fascinating. And it makes total sense that this is a changing time, and people have to hear about it, learn about it, and then see if it matches their values. And if it does, it's a real fit. Like, it's a real specific fit for a lot of people. That's amazing, Seth. I love that the Natural Funeral has kind of positioned itself to have global headquarters in Colorado and then expand and bring these options out there. I heard an interesting statistic a couple months ago, and I'm not sure if it's accurate, but it said that it was like over 70% of people are choosing cremation still, that flame cremation is still kind of the primary thing. So it'll be so interesting to see, like, what's the tipping point? Like when Nelson Mandela chose water cremation, I think it put alkaline hydrolysis kind of on the radar when a big, well-known, very worldwide name chose that. So I wonder what other kind of tipping points will come.
I don't know, but I'm so excited for them. And I think that, like you said, I think it will come around more prolific figures selecting these options for themselves that make those selections newsworthy, that allow people in diverse communities to hear about what's available to them.
Whatever happened to, remember there was conversation about a mushroom suit. People said they were going to be buried in a mushroom suit. What happened to the mushroom suit?
Yeah, let I'll give you my take on that is that it's a little bit maybe gimmicky.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, and I don't want to say there could never be a place for it. I just don't I haven't found it yet. What we do when we do a green burial is we'll line in the grave with natural organic material. And so we're actually adding biology to the grave along with the human body. And that's going to be bacterial and fungal biology. And so there's already going to be a presence of that near the body. With natural reduction, we actually take that several steps further. And I want to describe that really quickly. Our process of natural reduction, it takes place in a vessel that we call a chrysalis, and it mimics the dimensions of a green burial grave. So it's 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide by about 7 feet long. And we surround the body with wood chips, straw, and alfalfa. And then before we close the lid and the body's in a really nice bed of those materials, we brew a tea. And this tea is a supercharged bacterial and fungal tea. So while we're not placing something that's been that has mushroom spores or that has something built into a fabric, we're actually turbocharging this vessel with billions of spores and billions of bacteria that we've specially characterized to help with our process. So we involve mycelium and spores and fungi and mushroom in our process, but it's not in a suit. It's more straight from the source.
That makes so much sense. I'm so glad you went into that detail because I do think it gives people more information, and the idea that the bacteria and the fungal material would be supercharged is a great image to think about. Kind of different than just the rocky soil of your, your private burial ground, potentially. But I just appreciate so much, Seth, that you and your partners provide these options and the experts to have these conversations with, so that people can choose what's right for them. Families can get information and choose what's right for their loved one or for themselves if they're pre-planning. So I just appreciate this so much. Is there anything else that kind of comes to mind that you would want to share here at the end?
Well, I guess I would just invite people to connect, and I would invite people to ask questions, ask them of our funeral home, ask them of the funeral home in your community, and everywhere that you can be a supporter to educate people about there being these additional options. I would just invite that and share with you my energy and enthusiasm for these methods. And the Natural Funeral tries to be a very transparent resource. So you could certainly visit our website and learn more about our offerings. We keep our general price list published publicly all the time. We always want you to know what services you get, how much they cost, and who's giving you those services. So connect with us, and blessings on your march for advocacy in your community.
I love it. Thank you so much, Seth. You can find out more about Seth and his partners at thenaturalfuneral.com. You can follow them on Instagram or Facebook. On Instagram, they are at The Natural Funeral Colorado. So check them out, see what there is. And Seth, I feel like we have to have a whole entire other podcast going back to this thing about how you support families sitting vigil with their deceased loved ones. And supplying dry ice and information and supplies to make that possible. That's a whole other conversation for another day.
Sounds great. I'd love to talk with you again sometime, Diane.
Me too. I think you've given us just a lot of really interesting insights into what's currently happening and what is going to continue to happen in the years to come with these natural, green, alternative burial options or body disposition options that might really fit your values and your budget and your interests. So thanks again to Seth of The Natural Funeral. And you can find out more about the work I do at bestlifebestdeath.com. You've been listening to the Best Life, Best Death podcast. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks again, Seth.
Thanks, Diane.